Let's turn today to 1 Corinthians and chapter 10 and verse 14. In the previous verses, we were considering how the Israelites, though they had come out of Egypt, had not entered the promised land, which was God's highest purpose for them. And then in that context, he had said in verse 12, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." And the example of the Israelites was given to warn self-confident Christians to be careful that they do not miss out on God's highest purpose, just like those Israelites missed out on God's highest purpose. And it is true that as Christians we face trial and temptation, but in this context, the apostle says in verse 13, that no trial or temptation has ever overtaken you, which is not common to man, and in which God will not give you grace to overcome. God will never allow you to be tempted beyond your ability. And that's a word that we must bear in mind at all times in relation to trials that come into our life, as well as temptation. Everything is weighed out by a loving Father who ensures that it never becomes too much for us. And we need to understand verse 14 in the context of these preceding verses. Therefore, and whenever we read in the scriptures the word therefore, we have to link it to the verses immediately preceding. And this is why it's been helpful to look at the previous verses. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Link that with verse 13, which says that God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability. But that does not mean that we have to do nothing on our part. God will certainly make a way of escape, as it says in verse 13, that we can overcome it or endure it, as it says there. But we also need to be careful that we don't put ourselves in the place of temptation unnecessarily. Even to a wholehearted disciple like Timothy, Paul had to write in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22, "Flee from youthful lusts." And in 1 Timothy 6 verses 10 and 11, he says, "Flee from the love of money, you man of God." So there we see that the apostle Paul tells Timothy to flee from the love of money, even though Timothy was such a wholehearted disciple who had already a great measure of freedom from the love of money. But we can never say that we don't need to flee from the love of money until our attitude to money has become the attitude that Jesus had to money. And none of us have reached there yet, and therefore there is a need for that exhortation to flee from the love of money for Timothy as well as for all of us. Now, why do I speak about money here? Because in Colossians chapter 3, we read that covetousness is idolatry. Colossians 3 verse 5. In the last part it says greed or covetousness or the desire to have or to possess what we do not have or possess already amounts to idolatry. And we have just been looking at 1 Corinthians 10:14 where it says, "Flee from idolatry." Putting these two verses together, we could say that greed is a form of idolatry, and therefore we are exhorted here to flee from greed. Flee from the desire to possess things which it has pleased God not to give you. We have to learn godliness with contentment with the things that God has provided for us. Never compare our lot with somebody else's. Idolatry is not just bowing down to idols made of wood and stone, but idolatry is giving anything the supreme place in our heart, which God alone should have. The first commandment in the Old Testament was, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, strength, and mind." This is what Jesus himself referred to as the first commandment in Matthew 22. And when we love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, There is no more place in our heart for anything else or anyone else. If there is a little bit of love of money in our heart, then we have to say that in that measure in our heart, we do not love God. We are called to love God with all of our hearts. And if in some corner of our hearts we have some attachment to a human being, then again we do not love God with all of our hearts. We are to love even people through God, in other words, with a divine love. And this is why our whole heart has to be given up to God. It's not enough that you have given up sins in our life, but that we also give up the attachment to legitimate things that hinders the singleness of our devotion to God. And so it says here, flee from idolatry, and there can be many forms of idolatry. Our job or our profession can be an idol. And one evidence of that is that when we don't get a promotion, we can be disturbed by it or depressed by it. Or if somebody who is junior to us gets promoted over us, and we are depressed by that or disturbed by that, that proves that our job was an idol in our life. And it is in such instances where we think we are free from idolatry that we discover how much idolatry still lies very much in us. If anything in the world can disturb our peace, disturb our joy, we can be sure that that thing is an idol. If something expensive in our home is broken or stolen or damaged, and that disturbs us, we can be sure that that thing was an idol in our life. And it's a good thing that it was damaged or stolen, so that we would stop being idolaters. And that's why God allows many things to happen in the lives of wholehearted believers. They have problems in their job. Other people get promoted over them. Their material things sometimes get damaged and destroyed. These are all ways and means by which God seeks to deliver us from all idolatry. Because when there is idolatry in our life, it becomes very difficult to overcome temptation. If you value some material thing in your home excessively, then when that is damaged or dropped and broken by someone, you can lose your temper. It's very difficult to overcome your temper at such a time. You can be very upset with a child for having broken something valuable in your home. The problem there is not with your temper, but with your idolatry of some material thing. If you had not idolized that material thing, you wouldn't have had a problem with anger in that particular situation. And so we see God does not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability, verse 13. But He cannot help us if we do not obey the exhortation to flee from idolatry. The worship of the opposite sex is another form of idolatry. And we saw that in 2 Timothy 2:22, that even a person like Timothy had to be exhorted to flee from youthful lusts, flee from those things that give young people bad thoughts. This is a very needed exhortation. Nothing must be great in our eyes except God Himself, His kingdom, His will, His name. These are the things that should concern us, as Jesus taught us in the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed be Thy name, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done. Those must be uppermost in our mind. And if those are not uppermost in our mind, then we are idolaters. And it's good for all of us to examine ourselves to see whether there is any form of idolatry in any part of our life. Because this may be the reason why 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13 may not seem to be working in your life. You may be wondering why certain temptations seem to trouble you and harass you so much. You need to go into verse 14 before you can experience the reality of verse 13. Because verse 14 says, therefore, which means since God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability, therefore, here is your part, flee from idolatry. Do not worship anything which distracts you from your devotion to God. It can be music. It can be Christian music, which plays such an important part in your life, which takes so much of your time. Maybe the practicing of some musical instrument. Maybe the singing in a choir that takes so much time that you do not have time for God, for His Word, and for prayer. This is happening with many people who imagine that they are serving the Lord in music, but their music has become an idol. It is not worldly music, it is Christian music, but their Christian music has become an idol, and the word of God to them is flee from idolatry. It can be a sport, it can be a form of entertainment or something which, though legitimate, is yet taking so much place in our life, something that is so important to us. And then we are constantly falling in temptation. And therefore, we need to take verse 13 and 14 together if we are to experience how God does make a way of escape for us. We can have victory over every single temptation if we have given our whole heart to God, make sure there are no idols there, and seek for grace in the time of need, and God will make a way for us to escape so that we can overcome temptation and glorify His name.